Hello, welcome back to Turn and Burn UK. Today I thought we'd do a introduction to the lathe. So this is for somebody who's just inherited a lathe, or if you're thinking of buying a lathe and you just really want to understand what the component parts are. This is the lathe that I use most of the time. This is the Axminster 1628. We'll start at this end. So this is the motor. The motor drives the whole unit. In this case it's got 1.5 horsepower. The small lathe that Ben uses and that we use on demonstrations is a 0.5 horsepower motor. Is dependent on the size of your lathe. Bigger the lathe, bigger the motor, and it's the motor that provides the torque to turn the bit of timber. This is the headstock. Inside the headstock you've got the belt that drives the spindle. That is directly connected to the motor. I'll put a picture in because it's hidden away in here. This lathe has got two belt settings, a high ratio and a low ratio. So if you're turning really large pieces of timber, put the belt on the low ratio so that it has a little bit more torque to turn that timber and will allow you to cut without just bogging down the lathe. This is the spindle handle and this is the spindle itself. The handle you can use to manually turn the spindle. So once you've got your bowl on here or you have a spindle in here, you can turn using the handle just to make sure that everything is turning smoothly. It's not going to catch your tool rest or anything else near the bed before you actually turn the lathe on. Turning the lathe on this one we've got a magnetic box with the start and stop buttons. So this allows me to position the start stop wherever I want it. So if I'm turning a large spindle, I can have it down here when I'm working at this end of the lathe, or if I'm turning a large bowl and I'm about here, I've got it right to hand in case I need to stop things quickly. On this lathe it also comes with a variable speed setting and a forward and backward switch. Now on some of the older lathes you won't have a variable speed. You'll have a set of belts at the end of the lathe within the headstock. So if you need to turn the speed up, you've got to turn the lathe off, you've got to move the belt onto the next setting and then start again. The modern lathes, a lot of the modern lathes have got a variable speed, which makes it a lot easier, and it also allows for you to turn the speed up in very small increments. This headstock can twist, so you can undo the headstock locking bar, pull out the pin, and the whole thing will move. So this is great if you have a bowl. You can turn the headstock and then you can bring your banjo out, and it makes it easier to get a nice swing when you're hollowing the bowl. This is the banjo. So the banjo holds the tool rest and is movable up and down the entire length of the bed. This is the banjo locking bar, so you hold it in place, and then this is the locking pin that locks the tool rest in place. Tool rests that come supplied with the lathe generally are made from cast iron. There is a tendency for these to snap at the top of the stem here. This usually happens when you're working on a piece of wood and you're at the very end of the rest here, and if you get a catch and the tool slams down onto this end, the very end of the rest, that's when it can snap here, and that's where it generally fractures, and that's because there's not as much support at these ends. So when you're turning, you should always try and aim to turn within the middle bit of the rest. Also, because these rests are cast iron, they can be quite soft, so the rest can mark. You can get tool marks on the rest, so it's advisable to regularly just sand the rest down with a bit of 120, 240 grit paper and some oil, just to take out those dinks. And that means when your tool is running across the top of the rest, it runs nice and smoothly. You can get modular rests. Axminster Saw make modular rests. So this comes with a stem, and the stem unscrews, and you can put different size rests onto that stem. What you have to be aware of is that different lathes have different diameter shafts, so make sure you get the correct size stem for the banjo on your lathe. But if you talk to Sorby or Axminster, they can make sure that you get the right size rest. These are your bed bars or your lathe bed. These are cast iron. A lot of them come as a flat bed, but Record Power also make some of their lathes with round bed bars, exactly the same basis, but they're round steel bars. Moving down the lathe, we've got the tailstock. This is movable, so you move the tailstock up and down. On the back of the tailstock is the locking bar to lock the tailstock in place. So if you're working on a spindle, you'll have the spindle in this end, bring it up to this end, lock the tool rest, lock the tailstock in place, and then this is your quill, which moves in and out of the tailstock itself using this handle, and that allows for you to bring the centre up into the timber and tighten it in place. So talking about holding spindles in place, at this end you have drive centres. Drive centres come in different types. Usually you get a spur drive with the lathe, and this has got four prongs and a point in the middle, and that bites into your timber. That just slides in there. I also use a ring centre, which has got a ring and a spike in the middle. I've also got a live centre to go in the quill at this end, which is also a ring and a spike. This is quite useful when you're turning a spindle and you want to swap it round, because the spike and the rings can line up. It makes it really easy to make sure that when you swap the timber round, they're still central. This is a crown drive, so it's called a crown because you've got these crown spikes around the outside and then a point in the middle. That digs into the timber, and those spikes hold the timber in place, and there's less likelihood of that slipping in the timber, whereas the four prongs can tear out the timber and just spin in place, especially when you're using wet timber. So those are your drive centres. At this end in the quill you can put live centres. So live centres spin, so when the timber is between centres and it's turning, this turns with the timber, and it means that you don't mark, other than the spike in the end of the fibres, you're not leaving any marks or scorch marks in the spindle. Before centres, live centres were invented, they were dead centres, so they would be the same as your drive. They'd be fixed, and then the wood would spin on the point in the dead centre, and you would find that once you'd finished turning, there was a scorch mark in the end from the friction. So different live centres. So that's the ring live, crown live centre. Again, that will match up with the crown at this end, so you can swap them round. And then you've got a cone centre. Now the cone centre is generally the one that you'll get with your lathe, and this will dig into the timber. There's nothing stopping it going further and further into the timber. So you have to be careful using one of these, because you can wind your quill in and it will just keep pushing the cone into the end of the timber. And if you're not careful, there is a risk you could split your timber. Also at this end you could put a Jacob's chuck. So this is a Jacob's chuck. It's a drill chuck. You can put in drill bits in here, and then that will slide in there, and then the increments on the quill will allow you to set how deep you want to drill into your piece of timber. A lot of the lathes have got what is called a self-ejecting tailstock, so as you wind the quill in, it pushes out your centre that's in this end. Now, older lathes have this shaft is called a Morse Taper. On the older lathes they're 1 Morse Taper. On the more modern lathes they come as a 2 Morse Taper. So if you inherit a lathe or you buy a second-hand lathe, make sure you're aware of the size of your Morse Taper, because if you buy the wrong size it won't fit in your tailstock or your headstock. On some of the bigger lathes like the VB, they go up to a 3 Morse Taper. On your spindle this end, if you're not using your drive centres, the spindle comes threaded so that you can either put a faceplate onto there, that just screws on like that. You can use a faceplate to hold timber, so if you don't have a chuck you can use the faceplate. You screw your blank onto the faceplate and then you can turn your blank. You have to, the one restriction with the faceplate is that you need to cater for the screws that are going into the base of your blank here. If you have a chuck, you can use a chuck instead. That also screws on here. Different lathes have different size screw threads, so again, when you get your lathe you just need to make sure that the screw thread that you have that matches the screw thread within the chuck. Record Power, this is a Record Power SC4 chuck. They have an insert on the back. That insert comes off, so if you sell this lathe and buy a new lathe with a different thread, you can take the insert out, put a new insert in, and you're good to go. The Axminster chucks the body is threaded, which means if you buy a lathe with a different size thread, you'll need to buy a new chuck. I'm not sure whether Axminster do conversion rings. With the SC4, I received a faceplate ring with the in the pack. Now the faceplate ring is a bit more versatile than the actual faceplate, because you can screw the ring into your blank. You can turn the outside of the bowl, put a tenon or a recess on here, and then you can undo the chuck, swap it round, check that it fits in the jaws before you finish, and then once you've finished your outside you can unscrew the faceplate ring, hold it in your chuck and hollow the inside. I think that's covered the introduction to a lathe. I just want to talk about health and safety. So as well as buying a lathe, you need just to be aware of the risks involved. You've obviously got a spinning piece of timber. I take my rings off. I don't wear rings when I'm turning. You don't want to catch your rings. There's terrible hand injuries with rings being caught. I also wear toe cap boots in case I drop anything on my toes. Don't need to wear boots. It's entirely up to you, but obviously something stout on your feet to keep them safe. And then when you're turning, there is the act of turning, and especially the act of sanding, will generate dust. So you need to, I would advise purchasing an extraction system of some form when you're sanding, just to keep that dust down. If you haven't got an extractor, even just a hoover is enough just to keep that dust down. And when you're turning, I would also advise to wear some facial protection. Goggles are fine, but the goggles don't protect the whole of your face. It's worth getting a full face visor. I use the Honeywell Bionic visor. This has got a nice strong base to the visor that absorbs the shock, and I have been unfortunate to have a piece come off the lathe, and believe me, when it bounces off your visor, you're very, very glad to have had the visor in the first place. I hope that's been helpful. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And if you've got any queries, leave them in the comments at the bottom. Thank you. See you next time.